Hello, I'm Darkwell Bled and welcome back to Beyond the Rusted Gate. Today I have a sci-fi murder mystery for you in the form of a story I've called Murder on Anarok Station. Detective Arak's position on Anarok Station was a formality more than anything else. One could not sneeze, let alone commit a crime, within the large deep space facility without it being picked up on multiple cameras, microphones, and sensors, and then relayed to and through the facility's central brain. This brain, a synthetic hybrid of biological and mechanical engineering, linked all systems throughout the station into a hive-mind network that both managed and maintained all technical operations of the facility, as well as monitoring and observing all organic inhabitants. Despite this, Nexonian law clearly states that the process of law could not be left entirely to AIs, and so, with over 900 inhabitants living on Anarok Station, Detective Arak's position within the facility was deemed a necessity. Crimes on a hive station, though inadvisable and uncommon, were by no means non-existent. They often took place in the form of regulation apathy or crimes of passion. It was a being disregarding the airlock speed limit or an angry fight over a card game more often than not. Detective Arak's role in all this was a simple one. The crimes would occur, the station's sensors would witness it, then the hive mind would collect, collate, and condemn as it saw fit. In all of this, all that was left for Detective Arak to do was to review, then sign off on its findings. It had never been wrong, should never be wrong, and had always been entirely thorough and logical. In Detective Arak's 10 years as the station's naturally formed sentient law enforcement officer, he had never seen an incomplete or unsatisfying account of an offense come across his monitor. That was, at least, until now. It simply read, "Assault in progress. Murder in progress." The detective stared at the report. It was evidently incomplete and furthermore had been sent to him seemingly while the crime was still ongoing. There was no mention of who had been attacked, where, by whom, or when. All information that should be provided in a complete report following an incident, not during. With the station spanning dozens of levels, hundreds of rooms, and nearly 1,000 inhabitants, Detective Arak was somewhat at a loss as to what it was he should or could do with such information. It was, to begin with, unusual that his office would even be informed of an ongoing incident. His role was purely to deal with completed incidents, and it was down to the COGs, AI drones under the control of the hive mind, not him, to attend to ongoing offenses. In light of this, in addition to the apparent possible murder, how and why he had been informed of the issue to begin with was a mystery in itself. Despite this, one thing remained clear. Something was or had gone wrong. Detective Arak considered the situation. On previous postings before being assigned to this station, he would never have thought twice about following up on such a message. And it had technically come to him, even if it hadn't actually been meant for him. There was surely no harm in following up on it, even if all it led to was his learning that the hive mind had made a mistake and that the COGs were already addressing the issue. Leaning forwards on his chair, he pressed down on the small button in front of his desk's holographic monitor and spoke. "Computer, against whom is the assault taking place?" he queried. "Unknown," said the cold robotic voice. "Where is or where did it take place?" he asked. "No information beyond provided report is known," came the response. "How can you report on a crime you don't know anything about?" Detective Arak muttered more to himself than he did to the monitor. "No ongoing crimes detected," responded the voice. Detective Arak let out a heavy sigh and, pulling himself to his feet, began to pace. When he had first been transferred to Anarok Station, he hadn't trusted the heavy reliance on machines, but then, over the years, his convictions had been whittled down, and he had become complacent with the ease of his job. Too complacent, perhaps, he thought, and now he found himself in a situation where it looked as though he would have to actually earn his week's paycheck. A crime had likely been committed, if that itself wasn't an error, and if a crime had not been committed, then whatever was wrong with the facility's hive mind would still need to be urgently solved. Whatever the case was, today Detective Arak found himself with a most unusual puzzle to investigate, a puzzle in which the first point of concern was not who had committed a crime, but instead whether a crime had been committed, and if so, against whom. It occurred to him that while there was no timestamp on the report, as transfer of information on the station should be nearly instantaneous, the arrival of the report itself on his monitor may suffice. He stopped pacing, turned back to the monitor, and pressed down on the small button once more. "When did," he began, but was stunned into silence by an explosion or impact that shook the entire station around him and knocked him off his feet. Pulling himself up and quickly moving towards the window of his small office, Detective Anarok looked out into the blackness of space and half expected to see that they had fallen under attack. He had heard rumors of roaming nation pirates out this far, and had even heard of them coming to blows with the Nexonian navy, so their hitting a civilian station was not impossible. His fears, however, slowly relaxed into confusion. There was, so far as he could see, nothing but stars. No other ships were in their vicinity, just blackness, stars, and then debris. Like a morning mist rolling over the mountains, slowly Detective Anarok became aware of a cloud of mangled mechanics, metal, and corpses floating away from the obscuring bulk of the station that widened beneath him. They tumbled through zero gravity, cold, silent, and dead. Several levels below him, many of the facility's inhabitants had just been sucked out into the cold vacuum of space. Detective Anarok swore in several tongues that he was not fluent in, and turning away from the window, marched back to his desk and the button. "What caused the explosion?" he demanded. "No explosion detected." He paused. Sometimes the computer acquired annoying levels of exactness. "What caused the damage to the station?" he tried. "No damage detected." More swearing. Something had clearly gone wrong and people had died. He had seen the bodies, and yet his monitor seemed to have no knowledge of the situation whatsoever. Pulling on his belt and holstering his sidearm, Detective Anarok moved to leave his small quarters. The door hissed open, and on the other side he found pandemonium. The lights were intermittently flickering, possibly damaged by whatever had gone on downstairs, though that seemed unlikely as there were so many levels above. Organic sentients of many species were running down the hallway in frantic fear. He grabbed the long, thin arm of an Aldean as it attempted to run past. He pulled it aside and demanded answers. "What's going on?" Detective Anarok questioned. The Aldean, a species known for their sky blue complexion, complete with wispy white cloud-like markings that slowly moved across their skin, had turned nearly transparent out of fear. Detective Anarok could see the creature's lungs inflating and deflating, dark black blood pumping, and hearts beating rapidly. "The station's gone mad," it spat. "I see that," said Detective Anarok, "but what has caused you all to act mad?" he asked, annoyed.
"Not us, the station," it yelled, twisting its arms out of Anarok's grip. "There was an explosion. The lights are flickering and life support is down. I'm getting off while I still can," it said, turning and resuming its path down the hallway towards the nearest life pods. Detective Anarok tilted his head and strained his ears past the immediate commotion in an attempt to hear the telltale hissing of the station's life support system. There was none, and for a moment he allowed himself to wonder if life support was just down in this hallway, or if it had been down in his quarters too, or whether the issue was station-wide. Life support not functioning was, in itself, not an immediate issue. There was enough oxygen on the station to last weeks, and the cogs would have it fixed by then, but it was perhaps emblematic of a larger problem at hand. However, how this was all tied together, Detective Anarok was not at all certain. His pondering was broken by dull thuds which could be felt reverberating through the floor of the station, attesting to the fact that, indeed, life pods were being launched, and many beings were alarmed enough by the apparent widespread goings-on that they were evacuating themselves from Anarok Station. With haste, Detective Anarok moved towards the station's nearest elevator. There was clearly a problem, and though he had no idea what it was, he was becoming increasingly sure it was tied to whatever had happened down below. Someone had apparently been attacked, but who and by whom was not clear. An explosion or impact had occurred, but how, why, and whether it was connected to the assault was also not clear. The elevator doors closed behind him, and Anarok allowed himself a moment of pleasure in finding that at least this system seemed to be functioning. Then the robotic voice asked his intended destination, and Detective Anarok considered. The most likely solution to his problems was that the causes of the assault and the explosion were in fact one and the same. It was conceivable that someone had killed someone and that their death had resulted in the explosion, killing a heavy vehicle operator while they were behind the controls, perhaps. Whatever the case, as the two incidents had occurred so close together, it was more likely that they were linked than it was that they were unrelated, so the location of the explosion was the most logical place to focus his investigation.
However, beyond the vagueness of it having taken place below his quarters, he wasn't exactly sure on what level it had occurred, and the system, when asked, had seemingly had no knowledge of any issue whatsoever. Suddenly an idea occurred to him. "Computer, has usage of this lift increased recently in passenger numbers beyond average?" he asked. "Affirmative. Usage up 513% over usual daily traffic at this time," it confirmed. "From which level did this spike in usage first occur?" he pressed. "The increase began on level 3. This cabin was filled in excess of recommended weight and unit capacity by several times its limit," it said. Detective Anarok nodded, satisfied. If level 3 was the place people had first begun fleeing, then that was where the issue had taken place. "What is your destination?" the computer repeated. "Level 3, Detective Anarok ordered. The hallways of level 3 were eerily quiet. As home to a large hangar bay, the third level of Anarok Station would usually be bustling with trade and travel. It now, devoid of the rabble of sentient life and absent of life support's ambient hissing, was completely silent. All the main doors to the hangar were sealed, something that should only occur in an emergency, and with growing apprehension, Detective Anarok found himself becoming increasingly certain that it was this main hangar whose former occupants were now littering space. He approached a door and activated its comm system. "Does the hangar bay have atmosphere?" he asked. "No issues detected." Detective Anarok glanced uneasily towards the silent ventilation system. The monitor in his quarters had not reported that life support was down and had not known about the explosion. The hallway monitor here seemed equally unaware of the lack of life support in the hallway. Its failure to detect any issue did not exactly instill in him confidence in its ability to determine whether or not there was atmosphere in the room beyond, regardless of how interconnected the hive mind system should be. Detective Anarok paced back and forth and found himself wishing he knew more about computers. All areas of the station were equipped with maintenance cogs, so chances were, if atmosphere had been lost in the hangar bay, then it should by now have been restored. However, by the same nature, cogs should have also restored life support, which they evidently had not. If there was a breach and the breach remained, then opening the door would result in his being vented into space along with the others. This prospect did not in the least appeal to him. However, opening the door was also, so far as he could figure, the only way of discovering what was going on. Taking a deep breath, he braced his back against the wall of the hallway, crossed his fingers, and ordered the door to open. Upon the door opening, the atmosphere in the hallway did not explosively decompress, and Detective Anarok let out a long sigh of relief. Within the hangar, normality was being restored. The breach that had evidently existed in the hangar's outer doors had been patched with heavy sheets of metal, and maintenance cogs were going about performing several smaller repairs. Detective Anarok approached a pair of these drones intent on getting to the bottom of the day's strange events. "What happened here?" he asked. "Unknown," said the first drone. "The hangar doors failed to open for an approaching ship. There was a collision," said the second. Behind them, Detective Anarok watched as two identical cogs unevenly lifted a heavy crate, with one drone applying force a half-second before the other. He returned his glance to the two supposedly integrated drones that clearly had uneven knowledge. Systems supposedly connected across the entire ship were unable to relay or detect the simplest pieces of information, while maintenance drones were unable to coordinate even the most basic of tasks. It was in this moment that Detective Anarok realized he had all the evidence necessary to conclude both who had been killed and where. Making his way to the elevator, Detective Anarok took the lift to the center of the facility, where one would find both the proverbial heart and literal brain of Anarok Station. The entrance was guarded by two security cogs, and though he realized it would likely be futile, Detective Anarok, cautious that the killer may still be behind the doors they guarded, paused and attempted to gain information. "Who is behind that door?" he demanded. "Unknown," said the first cog. "You don't know who is in the room of the central brain?" Detective Anarok asked. "We are suffering from individuality," admitted the second cog reluctantly. "Yes, I know," agreed Detective Anarok as he drew his sidearm. "Open the door and be ready for combat," he instructed. The two cogs, drawing weapons of their own, moved to flank him, and the door to the central control hissed open. The floor of the room beyond was slick with neural lubricant and odiously fetid with the rank smell that so unusually and uniquely belongs to synthetic mechanical biological hybrids. The killer was gone, but the victim was still present. The dome containing Anarok Station's central brain was shattered, its brain stuff smashed and obliterated. Cables and flesh were strewn about the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, dripping black ichor and green coolant. The brain was dead, the hive mind ended, and the victim found. Anarok Station had been murdered. Thanks for listening. That was Murder on Anarok Station, or perhaps it should be called Murder of Anarok Station. If you would like a copy of the short story for yourself, it exists in paperback form in my second collection of short stories, Screams from Beyond the Crypt, which should be available from most online bookstores. If you would like to hear more spooky stories, I am trying to do one per fortnight, so subscribe and check in the next 2 weeks. Until then, I have been and still am Darkwell Bled. Stay spooky.